So we've got a new paper coming out predicting educational achievement from DNA, and we've seen a really exciting move towards this individual prediction for various traits such as height and weight. But could you tell me a little bit about how you do this?
So yeah, there have been some very exciting advances happening in molecular genetics research that allow us individual prediction based on someone's DNA. So we call this method polygenic scoring. And what we do here is, for example, imagine we take one individual and genotype that person, and then we look at their DNA to see how many of those genetic variants that are associated with a certain trait this individual carries in their DNA. And then we can sum up these effects for those genetic variants to form a polygenic score. And we've also written an FAQ that describes this method in much more detail.
So polygenic scoring can be used for lots of different traits, so like height and weight. And in your study, you look at educational achievement. But could you just tell me a little bit about your results?
Yeah, exactly. So with polygenic scores, you can really look at any sort of trait. But in our study, we looked at educational achievement. And we found that based on these polygenic scores, we can actually predict 10% of why individuals differ in their educational achievement at age 16.
So 10% doesn't really sound like a lot, but is 10% quite a lot in terms of prediction?
So for molecular genetics perspective, this is actually a very large effect size. So imagine, for example, gender differences that are often thought to create massive differences between individuals. They only account for around 1% of why individuals differ in educational achievement. So 10% is actually a very large prediction.
So what does this mean for the classroom? You talk about 10% prediction, but what does this mean in terms of grades, kind of in practice?
So yeah, what we found in our study was that actually those with the highest polygenic score, they had a grade between A and B on average, whereas those with the lowest polygenic score, they had a grade between B and C on average. So that's a whole grade difference between those individuals. And we were also really interested to see what proportion of these individuals got on to do A-levels, which is an important educational step before going to university. And we actually found that those with the highest polygenic score, around 65% of these individuals went on to do A-levels, whereas for the lowest polygenic score group, we only found that there was about 35% of those who went on to do A-levels. So that's quite a big difference.
Wow, so that's really impressive. And what do you think polygenic scores can be used for in future in terms of the classroom and also kind of education more broadly?
So by using these polygenic scores, it is actually possible to identify those, for example, who are maybe at heightened risk for a learning disability, for example. So imagine a scenario where we could use a polygenic score very early on to give us information about whether someone might have some learning problems later on. And if we had that information, we could act very early on and perhaps create some interventions to prevent severe problems later on.
So what do we think in terms of how long until these polygenic scores can be used in the classroom? Are we thinking a week, a month, a year, 5 years?
Well, currently this is very difficult to predict because, first of all, it'd be very important to create a dialogue between the researchers and the policymakers before we can even start thinking about taking this into the classroom. But for right now, this is actually a very useful research tool, and hopefully in the future we can also use this to apply it in the classroom.